everyone, welcome to Live Your Language, tips and inspiration for your bilingual life. I am Stephanie, a PhD student in second language acquisition and a mother to two children I am raising bilingually in my non-native language French. And today we're going to be talking about OPOL, the one parent, one language method of raising bilingual children, and specifically some of the sticky situations that you might encounter if you have chosen this method for your bilingual parenting. A lot of parents raising bilingual children use the one parent, one language method or the one person, one language method because it's actually pretty straightforward. It's as it sounds if you're not familiar with it. One parent speaks the minority language, one parent speaks the majority language. But what about situations where the parent who's speaking the minority language comes in contact with the majority language, or a person who speaks the majority language but they're around their child? That's basically at the heart of most of the situations that I'll be discussing today. Now, I know every parent does things a little bit differently, but the way that I approach these difficult situations really stems from 3 or 4 main ideas that I always try to keep in mind no matter what situation I'm in. The first is that I only ever address my child in the minority language, regardless of who's around. I think that it's just really important to stay consistent, and especially in my situation where my husband does not speak the minority language, I just think it's really important to make sure that I'm always addressing my child in the minority language. Now, along the same lines, the second principle is to maximize the minority language interaction and input. The third principle I follow is to minimize the majority language input, at least while I'm around. And the fourth principle is to always find an equivalent language tool for your child to use in the minority language if you do come across a majority language situation. I never want the situation where my child only knows how to say a certain thing in the majority language but not the minority language. So that being said, let's dive right into the difficult situations that you might encounter if you're using the one parent, one language method. The very first one is one that I find myself in, and that is the second parent does not speak or understand the minority language. Now, because I only address my son in French, the minority language, that means that there is language happening in my household that my husband cannot understand. The way I address this without ever switching into English to my son is I address my husband in English, of course, because that's the only language we have in common. And anytime there's anything particularly relevant or interesting or funny, I do relay that to my husband and I translate that back to him. But I just make sure that I'm really careful about not addressing my son directly in the majority language, which in my case is English. Now, I'm not suggesting that this situation is ideal. Of course, I would prefer for my husband to be able to understand everything my son says, but I just think the stakes are too high to make a conditional switch. My son has really caught on to this, and I think that it's paid off because now we've gotten to the point where he will look at my husband, say something in English, and then look directly at me and say the same thing in French. The other thing about this situation is that it's a little difficult in the beginning, especially because my son was definitely dominant in French and still is to a certain extent, and his language was so limited. But as he has gotten older, his English vocabulary has really expanded. So yes, there was a point where my husband really wasn't understanding a lot of what he said, but that is really changing rapidly. The next difficult situation that you might encounter if you're doing the one parent, one language method is family or friends visiting that do not understand or speak the minority language. So this is difficult because we really go through pains to make sure that the child is hearing enough of the minority language while they're at home with us. A lot of parents feel really threatened by having this outside language coming in and encroaching on that minority language time. The way that I address this is really to make sure that I'm making extra efforts to speak the minority language with my son and kind of sneak in minority language interactions where I might not normally do so. I actually have an entire video where I discuss everything that I do, and I will link it below. Some of the tips that I discuss in that video include making sure that I make the most of the time that we have together doing bath time or diaper changes, any time basically that I'm alone with my son, I try and maximize that. If not just to speak naturally, I try to discuss things that have happened earlier that happened in English, and I try to talk about them just so that he has the vocabulary to discuss those events in both languages. So the third sticky situation I'm going to talk about is what to do about phone calls that need to happen in the majority language. So those phone calls that are incoming, you can't really do much about it. You can try to step away if you can, but I know that's not always possible. Now, concerning outgoing phone calls, I really think it just depends. So if it's a business phone call, then I would definitely suggest waiting if you can until later to make that phone call. And I think most people probably do anyway because it's quieter. But if it's a phone call with family or friends, then I think that should be treated a little bit differently. For example, I speak with my twin sister who does not speak French every single day with my son around. We actually have conversations at breakfast time, and it's very interactive. It's not just a passive conversation. So what will happen is I will speak to him. Of course, I'll address him in French. She will address him in English. If there's something she says in English and I want to say something about it, or he doesn't understand, or he's not responding, I will go ahead and say that in French for him. And interestingly, I have seen his English language development grow tremendously because of this interaction, but he has been no less willing to address me in French. It's not as if after our conversations he's just speaking English to me all the time. The last sticky situation, and probably one of the most difficult I would say, is what to do when strangers address your child in the majority language when you're out and about. For example, on a walk or at the playground. This is really tricky because you don't want to address your child in the majority language, but also the strangers don't know that you're doing the one parent, one language method. I'll often end up with an awkward wait where you're speaking to your child in the minority language and maybe they're not responding as they should. They're not saying hi, they're not smiling, they're just kind of staring. And the stranger is just kind of there waiting for a response. In that case, sometimes I will go into English to say something simple like, say hello, after having said it repeatedly in French and just getting maybe like blank stares or, I don't know, irrelevant comments. Reflecting on this, I think that the better way to handle it is probably just to turn directly to the stranger and address them, smile, wave. I don't really know what else to do other than that. If you have any suggestions, please leave comments below because this is one that always gets me. Okay, those were 4 difficult situations you might encounter if you are raising your child with the one parent, one language method. I know that everyone is different. There's no right way or wrong way to do it, but in this video, I'm just sharing what I do. Also, if you found this helpful, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss any future ones, and I will see you in the next video.